Okay. Shabbat Shalom and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study. Let's see if I can turn this down. Thought I had all that done. So welcome. It's good to be here with you today. Thanks for joining us for this, our fourth class in a new series on the 10 words. So I'm excited to teach this topic. I prepared some things today that I think provide us with everything that we need to fully get into the meaning behind the words of the words, if you will. So we're going to be taking, over the course of this study, a very close look at the words of the 10 words, which according to our sources, primarily I'm talking about the Torah, according to our sources, these words were written on 2 tablets with the finger of God in stone. Now we have 15 references in Scripture, 15 distinct references to 2 tablets. We have 15 references that mention 2 tablets. All of these tell us that the writing upon the tablets was done with the finger of God. We know that the writing was on the front and the back. There are some things that we don't know. We don't know, for instance, the size and the shape. Now, there are plenty of artistic renditions. We have Rembrandt, we have various Christian painters, we have Jewish synagogues, even ancient depictions in Jewish synagogues and so forth of the 2 tablets. But we really don't know. If we rely on our sources, if we rely on the biblical text, it doesn't say how big they were. It doesn't say whether they were rounded at the top. We don't know how big they were. We get some indication, there are some texts which seem to imply, based upon the singular, that Moses carried them in his hand, singular. So are they small? I mean, we have ancient examples of stone tablets that are written in cuneiform. Are these to be somewhat of an example for us? Are we supposed to look at these and say, well, maybe this is what they look like? All of these ideas are conjecture. All these ideas are not written in stone, as you might say. In other words, we just don't know. We don't know what kind of stone the 10 words were written on. Was it flint? Was it, all of these different things that we might speculate on. The rabbis talk about this, how they were a certain color and hue, and the letters would take certain shapes and forms, and there are all sorts of different stories that are out there, but we just don't know. In fact, we don't know what was written on each stone. If you have 2 stones, stone A and stone B, we don't know what was written on A versus what was written on B. Some have suggested that these stones were identical. In other words, what was written on the one stone was written in duplicate on the other stone. But we don't know that. The Scripture doesn't say that. There is a major idea, one of the biggest theories that's put forth, is that on one stone are those words or commandments or sayings that are associated with man's relationship to God. In other words, those certain number of the words of the 10 words which deal with man and God, those were written on the one stone. And then those which deal with man's relationship with other man, human to human, that those would be written on the other stone. Now, all of these ideas are good suggestions, but it's all they are. We really don't know. Scripture doesn't tell us. And on the one stone, Jehovah wrote with his finger the following things. We don't get that. We have only at our disposal We have only the information that we have, our sources from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible, the two main texts which tell us about the words, specifically about the words within the words, come to us in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. And that's it. Both of these texts, as I pointed out last week, both of these texts, both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, both of these claim to be the words that were spoken by God, spoken from the midst of the fire, as we've covered in previous classes, on the day of assembly, to the entire assembly of the nation of the children of Israel, as well as a group known only to us as the mixed multitude, that these words that are recorded in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5 represent those words. They were ultimately written on our two tablets. They were shattered by Moses when he witnessed the sin of the people associated with the golden calf. The stone tablets were made again a second time, according to our sources, this time by Moses. Moses makes the second set. He ascends Horeb again, and Yehovah writes on the second tablets the same words that were written on the first. Now, complicating our present story, the accounts in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5 contain differences. In last week's class, which I called Some Burning Questions, playing off the idea of the fire, which is so prevalent in the stories associated with the 10 words, they contain differences. Some of these differences are minor. Some of these differences are not so minor. In order to work through these, I have produced a chart which I'm going to ask you to use in today's class. I posted, when I advertised today's class, I posted on our Facebook group page and on my own page a link to that particular document. I'm going to ask that somebody help me and pull that up and paste that link so that you can get a direct link to the PDF. And if I don't see it and you can't do that, I'm sure somebody can, I'll do it, because I want to go through that chart today and I want to really dig a little bit deeper into something which I just discovered that I think is going to be quite helpful. But we're going to look at some of the differences. This is going to be a slightly different class than what I'm used to teaching, because I really want to highlight, if you will, some of the difficulties and complexities of the question that is before us. I pointed out last week, I want to state this again, that the words are different. The account of the 10 words, which claims, Exodus 20, claims to represent the words that were spoken from the midst of the fire on the day of assembly to the entire assembly of people. There are 172 words contained in Exodus's account. If you look at the complementary account in Deuteronomy chapter 5, it contains 189 words. I'm talking about the number of the words in the Hebrew. Again, both of these accounts claim to be the words that were spoken from the midst of the fire on the day of assembly, but they're different. So we're going to be working through both of these. Now, out of a study of both of these accounts, what we are looking for, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, if you will, what we are looking for, we are searching to discover all that we can know from our sources. And so the method that I'm using is all that is available to us as students and, let's say, seekers, and that is to use a method of comparison, comparing the two accounts and then asking the question, although this is somewhat challenging to some, are they both correct? Is one correct? Or to put it in other words, do both of these accounts, do either of these accounts, or do neither of these accounts represent the words that were written on the stone tablets? Now, understand that this might make people a little uneasy, but you have to admit that the question is valid. The question is necessary because both of these claim to represent such a big part of the biblical story. We've got to get into this. We've got to look at this. The question behind the question is, what are the 10 words? There are no Roman numerals in the ancient Hebrew. There is no numbering system and no obvious way to discern what is word number 1, what is word number 2, and so forth and so on. Because of this, a great deal of confusion comes in. So part of the reason that I want to work through today's class, and I want to spend the time going through the chart, is because of something that I noticed in the Hebrew that I had not noticed before, actually. So I stated, now get this, there are no Roman numerals. There's no numbering or lettering system that says this is word number 1, number 2, number 3, and so forth. And I said that there's no other obvious way to discern the words in any specific order. But maybe there is. And that's one of the main points of today's class. So whereas most of my classes are pretty long, I don't know how long this will take, but I want to take only what's necessary to go through this, and I want to cover only this material because today's class is basically counting to 10, numbering the 10. And so once I cover that material, we'll call it a wrap, and then we begin next week's class going through a very, very detailed deep dive into the meaning of the words of the words. Now, again, so one of the points and the main point of today's class is to get the numbering down. And since we don't have numbering provided in the text, you can't really rely on counting the commandments within the 10 words. Because as I've stated before, there are 3 passages in the Torah, 3 passages in the Tanakh actually, which the English translates 10 commandments. But those places in the Hebrew don't say 10 commandments at all. It says Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words. So if you tried to rely on the counting of the commandments, you wouldn't come up with 10 at any rate. You would come up with a minimum of 13, and you'll see some of that today. So we can't rely on verse numbers either, because if you look at the verses, first of all, the addition of chapter and verses is a very late device, and those breaks are sometimes arbitrary. They're very handy. They're very helpful. Otherwise, when I teach from the Bible, I wouldn't be able to say, open up to Exodus chapter 20 and verse 2. I would have to say somewhere in the book of the second book of the Torah. It would be very difficult. So these are very helpful. But you can't rely on the verse numbers because in the Hebrew, as you'll see, there is another way to divide the text that we're really going to look at today. Within the 10 words, the 10 words contain not only commandments, they contain declarative statements. Anochi Yehovah Elohecha. I am Jehovah, your Elohim. All right? That's not a commandment. It's a declarative statement. And some, we'll get into this, but some see a certain reason for the opening of this covenant with those specific words. So we have declarative statements. We have commandments. I'm talking about just within the 10 words. We have sometimes material that is presented in the first person and sometimes in the third. So what this causes is for the careful student to begin making speculations. Some have suggested that despite the clarity of some of the words of the Torah that says God spoke all these words audibly, some have suggested, in order to make sense of the switching between first and third, that God only spoke the first couple of commands, and then Moses gave back to the people what he heard from God in the following commands. But those attempts to smooth out the complexities don't answer the deeper questions. Now, we also have within the 10 words certain qualifying material, additional material, at times lacking in the one and at times lacking in the other. So it's not so easy for us to say, I only want to believe that Exodus or Deuteronomy represents the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, the exact words that were spoken from the midst of fire on the day of assembly and ultimately engraved on stone. Because both of them at times present different complexities and different issues and opportunities in our solution to the problem before us. The Torah, though, is very clear on one thing, and that is that the words which were spoken on that day are called Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words. Sometimes people translate this as the 10 sayings, the 10 utterances, because remember, it's not all about commandments, but these 10 words, these 10 things. The question before us today, and the only question that I want to deal with today, is how do we arrive at 10? How do we come up with the 10? You would think that something this important would have a semblance of consistency between people who study the book. But even within Judaism, there are disagreements between Judaism and various forms of Christianity, Protestant, Catholic, Lutheran. There are differences of opinion. And look, it's not so easy to say, although you might want to say, I want to go with this particular version or this particular numbering because I trust this or that group, because there's so much uncertainty, as you'll see. So I think that this is not an exercise that's not important. I believe that it's very important that we understand what is or what are the 10, and how do we break them down? Do we get any clues other than these arbitrary assignments? So the question becomes, how do we number the 10? Is Anochi Yehovah Elohecha, that opening phrase, is that word number 1? Because according to the Talmud puts that as number 1. And they stand alone in terms of groups of numbering that 3-word statement basically they go a little bit more than that. They say that the opening words, Anochi Yehovah Elohecha, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the fire and so forth, they say that that is statement number one, word one. But they're alone in that. Some believe that that opening statement is sort of an opening declaration, as is common in these ancient Near Eastern covenants. You know, they have evidence. There's been a lot written on this from scholars to show that the form of the covenant that is communicated at Sinai or Horeb is comparable to other commands or other covenants from the ancient Near East. And what they've drawn out, these scholars have pointed out, is that it's very consistent, that the ruler would often declare King so-and-so who did the following thing for you as the opening portion of a covenant, and that would basically say, because I, King so-and-so, did the following things for you, here is the covenant that I'm making. So that the person who read it would look at this and say, well, you know, that king did that thing for us, so ultimately we are accountable to be in covenant with them, and that is the basis of the covenant. So look, I'm not saying that that is not a reasonable idea, but I'm going to dig a little bit deeper than that. There's plenty out there on the web that you can read on that. This week, in preparing for this class, I went through quite a few different books, charts, sources on the internet and in the library that you see behind me to get an idea for how various people numbered the 10. And what you'll find if you do your own research on this is that people are all over the board. I'll give you one example, and don't do it while I'm teaching, but put it in your notes and look it up later. If you go, for instance, to Wikipedia and you type in the 10 Commandments, and just look at that article. It's a decent article, by the way. But as you go through the article, there is a chart contained in the article that shows you probably 7 or 8 of the different enumerations from different traditional groups. So you can go to that article and just take a look. Now, again, you might be inclined to say, well, I think the Talmud has it right. But what we want to do is we want to see if there's something else that can help us to discern what are the 10. I think this is important. Again, remember, there's nowhere that says where the 10, there's no numbering system, and we don't know which ones are on which tablet. Now, how many of you have in your home maybe a plaque or a picture with the 10 Commandments? Maybe when all this is done, we'll make another one, and you can put it up because it might be closer to the biblical record. But that's okay. We'll see if we get that far. So I mean, among the major groups, I'm not talking about individuals because some of you are great biblical students and you may have come up with an agreement with one of these forms or the other, one of these enumerations or the other. But I'm talking about major groups like the Talmud, Philo, the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch. How do these groups number the 10? So only the Talmud, by the way, among the major groups, list as number one, according to the Talmud, is I am Adonai, I am Yehovah, your Elohim, who brought you out from the land of Egypt from a house of servants. According to the Talmud, this is word number one. But Protestants, Septuagint Philo, the Lutherans, Samaritan, Augustine make it an opening statement. So they don't even count this. It's like it's not even on the chart. If you look at the chart on Wiki, for instance, and by the way, that chart is also available in other documents and books that I've seen, so it's pretty reliable in terms of how do they count the 10. And so most of the groups that I just named, for instance, they look at the phrase, the statement that I just read, I am Yehovah, your Elohim, who brought you out from the land of Egypt from a house of servants. They make that just an opening statement. It's not counted among the 10. The Protestants, the Septuagint, and Philo have, for number 1, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, just so you know, at this class, at times when I'm quoting these commandments or words, if you will, I'll be using somewhat of the familiar, unless we're going by my chart. So in other words, you shall have no other gods before me, quite literally in the Hebrew, it's going to be something like this, and this is very, very literal. No, it will be to you other Elohim above my face. Right? So that's really, really literal. And I left it literal in my translation, which I continued to tweak and work on. But I wanted it to be very, very literal. It actually brings up more questions. What are Elohim Akarim? What are other gods? Or is it other God? And then what about above my face? What does that mean? What does it mean to say you shall have no other gods above my face? So we're going to get into that. So in other words, if I say to you that the Protestants and the Septuagint and Philo have for number 1, you shall have no other gods before me, that's what they claim is saying number 1. So they would put a Roman numeral next to, you shall have no other gods before me. But the Talmud says that number 1 is Anochi Yehovah Elohecha, I am Jehovah your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of servants and so forth. Now, the Lutherans, the Samaritan, and Augustine combine 2 commandments and make it word number 1. I want to show you the differences. I want to talk you through some of this so that when I begin to lay out the clue that the Bible gives us, you'll see the sense in it. You'll see that it's not arbitrary. But if you look at the Lutherans and the Samaritan and Augustine, they have this as number 1. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall make unto you no graven image. So they put these 2 as word number 1. So what you begin to see is that the count is going to be off depending on whose list. Now, some might argue that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how we number them as long as we get the content. And there's some truth in that. In other words, it doesn't matter if there's a number 1 besides Anochi Yehovah Elohecha, or if the number 1 is actually not placed until you shall have no other gods before me, or if it's not put on paper until you get to you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall make unto you no graven image. So long as you recognize that Jehovah is God, that He brought the children out of Egypt and out of the house of servants, and that you should not have other gods before Him, and that you should not make a graven image. So long as you know those things, that's the main point, and I would agree with that. But I think that it's important, and it drives me to continue. Otherwise, the class would be over if I said, well, it doesn't matter. I think it does matter. Just based on this, just based on the fact that we have differences as to what represents the number one word, we're going to have differences throughout. Does that make sense? In other words, if number one is a certain part of one and it's not the number one in another, you're going to be off. Every one of these groups ultimately arrives at 10. And they all have the same basic content. I'm not going to say that their translations are accurate, but they generally have the same content, and they all arrive at 10. They know they have to arrive at 10 because it says there are 10 words. But they do it in an arbitrary way. They do it in an arbitrary way. So, over the course of my studies in this subject and preparing for the class this week, I began to look again at something with which I felt I was fairly familiar. The account of the 10 words in Exodus and Deuteronomy. I looked at them again very carefully. I looked at them very carefully in the Hebrew. I checked some things in my notes, and I have files on these subjects. And I noticed something that I had not really noticed before, and it surprised me. How many times have you found something within the Scripture that you think, it's been there all along, and I never noticed it before? I know it happens to me from time to time, and when it does, I always am surprised. So I found something within the text of the Hebrew that is reflected in my chart that I've asked you to download. It's called A Comparison of the 10 Words in English, in which I'll hold it up. I have Exodus, the Exodus account, and I have the Deuteronomy account, and I have them side by side so that we can work through this together and we can note consistencies, but we can also note differences. I think this is very important. But we're also going to note something which is important in how do we number 10. How do we number 10? Now, you might disagree with the numbering, but it is the only system. I'm going to show it to you as we work through. I know some of you are probably jumping ahead. I'm going to ask you, put your paper down and wait for me. But some of you, when we work through this, you may not agree that that is the purpose for what I'm going to show you, but it is, however, a very textually based division of the content into 10 sections, which I believe provide us with the source that we need, the foundation of the 10 that we will then work forward to, or work forward in our study. So in other words, what I'm going to show you today is a method of counting to 10 in the content of the 10 words within our sources, and not according to our whim, not according to an arbitrary assessment or assignment of numbering, and not because someone that we trust, be it the Talmud or the Catholics or the Lutherans or Philo or whoever else, but something which is textually based. So I have often in my classes talked about something that I learned from James Tabor and from David Horowitz, who learned it from his teacher, Moses Gabori, and all of our group, a lot of the leadership team, we've been looking at this for years and years and years, and it has to do with what we call, colloquially, we call it white spaces. Spaces within the text. Remember, anciently, there were no chapter and verses. In fact, that's a very late Christian innovation. But the Hebrew Bible contains white spaces. Now, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to get up from my chair because I'm alone in the building, and I'm going to walk up to the camera and show you a close-up of this in my Bibles so that you get a feel for what I'm talking about. So if that might seem a little bit awkward, hey, blame the situation we find ourselves in because presently I am still up here by myself. So the Hebrew Bible has two forms of what I'm calling white spaces in the text. And by white spaces, I'll demonstrate it, I'll show it to you. It is a gap between words and sometimes lines. We have two types. One is open and the other is called closed. In Hebrew, it's petucha and setuma, open and close. We'll refer to these as major and minor breaks in the Hebrew text, and these are ancient. If you look in Torah scrolls, the white spaces are there. Not just in the Torah, but I'm just giving you a reference. If you look at ancient scrolls, even found at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain white spaces that most often agree with the spaces that are found in our modern Torah scrolls and in our modern Hebrew Tanakhs. So these are very important. And I believe that they provide us with quite a bit more than people have suspected. If you go to Israel, or if you go online and go to the Israel Museum, or if you look at photographs of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll see these white spaces. You know, in the scroll of the book, the copy, replica of the Isaiah scroll, the great Isaiah scroll, is on display in a very beautiful circular presentation behind glass. And as you walk up, you'll notice, among other things, the white spaces within the text. So that's what I'm talking about, is that these are preserved and they have meaning. They have meaning. Now, the setuma is the closed space, and by it, it's going to be, I'll walk over and show you my Bible in a minute, it's going to be a smaller, open section between the words of a line. It's noticeable and intentional, and it stands out visibly. When a person is reading in the Hebrew, they will notice this break in the text, and it ought to be so noticeable that it ought to make you think, well, what does this mean? It's reading the white between the black letters. There's something there. Now, that's the setuma, the smaller break. The larger break, the major break, is called the petucha. And the petucha it's called an open break, and it is going to begin a new line. Some have compared this with our paragraph. It's not necessarily equivalent, but I understand where they're going with that, because if you begin a new paragraph in English, you start a new line. And so it is with the petucha. If you begin a new section, major section in the Hebrew Bible, you will begin the next line. Now, if, for instance, the text goes all the way to the end of the line and starting a new line wouldn't indicate a major break, in the Hebrew Bible, an entire line will be skipped just to make you see that it's a major break. So here we go. I'm going to walk up. In fact, I'll show you. I have Exodus 20 opened up. And now this is kind of awkward because it takes me a minute to figure out which way to turn my Bible. So bear with me. I'm going to walk over. Okay. So what we have in front of you, this is part of the text of Exodus chapter 20. And you'll notice the white spaces here even in the English. And then over here in the Hebrew, the white spaces. Now notice this space here. this is a major break because the text ends here. If this were a minor break, as the one above it, you see the Hebrew letters begin here. All right? But a major and a minor break. Now, just to turn the page and kind of give you an further example, these are the 10 words. Let it come into focus. According to the book of Exodus, and you'll see how the breaks, both major and minor. See, here's a major break, and these are minor up above. So these are called setuma. This is called a petucha. All right. So I know this is kind of technical, but it's very important that we cover that because I want you to understand the system of breaks that is used in the Hebrew Bible and what that actually means. Now, one other example, this is from my Reader's Hebrew Bible, and I'll show you that as well. And we'll use Exodus 20 because we just did that with by the way, the Bible that I held up is called the Koren Tanakh. The Koren Tanakh, the Hebrew and English version of the Koren, is my favorite Bible. It is a bit bulky. See, it's a little bit thick. It's about 3 inches thick, and the print, as you saw, was somewhat fine, small. But it contains the Hebrew and the English. In my opinion, it is the best overall Hebrew to English translation on the market. I've written a review on that. You're welcome to read it. Now, here is Exodus 20 in my Bible that's called the Reader's Hebrew Bible. Let me do this again. All right. Now, I want you to notice in this version, you'll see, let's see if I can get this turned right. It's like backwards and, all right. You see the Hebrew letter here? And then as you work down, you'll see over here. Okay, we have 2 Hebrew letters that occur in the text. You'll see them in various places. It's hard for me to figure out which way to point, but you'll see sort of the break, and in the middle of the break, you'll notice the Hebrew letter. All right? Now let me explain that for just a moment. Make this a little bit bigger. This is the Hebrew letter Samech. All right? This, in my Reader's Hebrew Bible and in other Hebrew Bibles, represents the abbreviation for setuma. And that setuma it's not a new line. It just indicates a break in the text, a white space. So whenever you see the letter Samech in a Hebrew Bible, it indicates that this is one of those ancient spaces where there was a gap between the words. This is the Hebrew letter Pei. It stands for, it's an abbreviation in my Reader's Hebrew Bible, for Petucha, which is an open break, a major break, and it indicates the beginning of a new line. Now, why did I go through all that? Because what I want you to understand is that these breaks will prove to be helpful in our identifying words within the 10 words. You'll see this. And by the way, I put these in my comparison chart. Now, I have no way of knowing if all of you have been good Bible students and downloaded my chart or not, but I hope that you have, because this part of the class, I want to go through my chart to show you a couple of things. And without the chart, it's going to be very difficult to follow. So for some of you who will be listening to this on a podcast, you'll need to download the chart so that you can read this while you're running on your treadmill or whatever it is that you're doing. Now, My translation and my comparison chart of Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, I went and verified the white spaces, not only in my Hebrew Bibles that I have here, many of which are based upon what's called the Leningrad Codex. The Leningrad Codex, also known as B19, is the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible. And I wanted to make sure that when dealing with the 10 words, I have the most reliable, most ancient indication of breaks in the text, because as you'll see, it's significant. All right. So again, we're going to go through these, and we're going to make this point just to go through as an overview. I'm not going deeply into the meaning of the words. I'll be able to explain that when we tackle the words one by one as we work through these in our study. But I just want you to understand. So for instance, when I go through what I call word number 1, just to give you the numbering, I'm going to go with my translation here, but I'm not going to really dig deep and define idol, okay? So if I have translated idol, I'm not going to get into at this time, I will next week, but I'm not going to get into whether a pop star can be an idol, or a football team can be an idol, or your television can be an idol. You know, a lot of people say that. I'm going to go ahead and give you a clue. That's not true. But what we'll do is we'll talk about, when I say idol here, what's the Hebrew word? What does it actually mean? What was an idol? In other words, I don't want you to think, well, you know, I do like the New Orleans Saints. I guess I'm committing idolatry. Don't be silly. That's not the same thing. So hopefully some of you will know that, but those of you who don't, we'll cover it closely. So as I work through this over the next several weeks, I will be revising my own translation. I'm certain of it. And as I do, I'll upload revisions. So this is, my translation is fairly literal, as you'll see, but this series will better define the words within the words as a result of that. So I want it to be literal. For now, I just want you to understand what you're looking at when you look at this particular chart. A couple of words about the translation before we start. I've tried to be as consistent as possible, okay? So if I translate a phrase in Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20 exactly the same, that means that the Hebrew of Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20 is exactly the same. Where I indicate that they are different, I translate it differently. I also bring out the differences by using red. Now, this isn't what some of you are used to in red letter. Red letter may or may not be what you thought red letters were. Red letter should be bold and should cause you to take a deep breath and say, how do I deal with this? Because it's present in one, it's not present in the other, right? It is a divergent part. It is a variation. Doesn't mean it's not inspired. Don't get nervous. It just means that it's different. So I will translate phrases the same, where they are the same, where they are different, I translate them differently. Some of you who may not trust my translation, which is fine. Some of you know Hebrew. Read it for yourself. Some of you trust the particular translation that you have in front of you. Use it. In other words, if I say there's a difference between Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20, both of which claim to be the words spoken from the midst of fire on the day of assembly, you go look at your translation. I bet you that even in your translation, those differences will be there. So I have noted the differences in this translation on my comparison chart down to a single Hebrew letter. Here we go. You ready? Look at the opening line on the chart, top of page 1. Exodus 20 is on your left, Deuteronomy 5 is on your right. Notice that the first thing you will see on my chart, look at me, not the chart, is a samach. You'll see a samach. That means that there is a white space that comes right before the opening of these first words. Notice, please, that the samach is present in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 and is followed with an exact phrase in both. In the Hebrew, it says, Anochi Yehovah Eloheka, a phrase that occurs 8 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. So here's the English, exactly the same, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. I am Yehovah your Elohim, who brought you out from the land of Egypt from a house of servants. Same exact phrase. Now, according to the Talmud, this is word number 1. But notice, there is no gap. There is no white space until the end of verse 6 in Exodus 20 and verse 10 in Deuteronomy 5. So stay with me, because I am going to propose that the words are divided carefully, especially according to the white spaces in the Hebrew Bible. That these white spaces are not, ladies and gentlemen, they are not arbitrary, but they designate what is each word. So here we go. I'm going to read the Exodus version, and I want you to notice the red letters. That indicates that that is not present in the Deuteronomy version. No, I'm reading from Exodus, the second section blocked off. No, it will be to you other Elohim above my face. No, you shall make for yourself an idol. And is not in Deuteronomy. Every form that is in the heaven above, and that is on the earth beneath, and that is in the waters beneath the earth. No, you shall bow down to them, and no, you shall serve them, because I, Yehovah, your Elohim, zealous El, am accounting iniquity of fathers upon sons, upon third and upon fourth, for one's hating me and doing loving kindness to thousands, for one's loving me and for one's guarding my commands. Deuteronomy has his commands. See, notice there's a difference. First person, third person. Now, what I'm going to propose to you that we count as word number 1 within the white spaces, the beginning of which is after a white space in both Deuteronomy and in Exodus. They match exactly, and it begins, Anochi Yehovah Eloheka, and it runs all the way unto the word commands. Word number 1 deals then with exclusivity. And we're going to get into this much, much more in depth next week. So in other words, you have the one God who brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of servants. You can't have other gods above his face, whatever that means. You can't make idols. You can't bow down. You can't worship, and so forth and so on. We're going to get into that in great, great detail. Now, what do we do with the differences? We'll dig deeper into that, but I want you to recognize that I'm looking at the consistency here between the two. And both accounts, is it just happenstance that both accounts have the breaks exactly at the same word? Or is there something more? The next break. So notice at the end, after the word commands in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, now look at the screen, you have a samach. In the Hebrew, you have a division in the text indicating that there is a break. Then, Exodus and Deuteronomy, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 match word for word, letter for letter. And white space to white space says, no, you shall lift the name Yehovah, your Elohim, for falsehood, because Yehovah will not clear one who lifts his name for falsehood. White space. Now, interestingly enough, Deuteronomy 5 uses a samech. See how I mix my hands up? A samech. And Exodus 20 uses a pei. But what is interesting is that both indicate a break in the text here. Now, I believe that that sets off word number 2. So we have word number 1, which deals with exclusivity of worship, which I'll teach on very, very detailed. And then the second word deals with the lifting of the name for falsehood, whatever that means. That's part of the class as well. The next word, I want you to look with me. There is a considerable variance between the account in Exodus and the account in Deuteronomy. Now, some of you may be trying to say, well, Exodus is the original and Deuteronomy is not, because Deuteronomy is Moses' retelling and therefore we could expect differences. But remember, both Exodus and Deuteronomy both say these are the words that God spoke, right? So they shouldn't vary it. They shouldn't vary at all. But they do. Notice in Exodus 20, remember the Sabbath day to separate it. And Deuteronomy 5 says to guard the Sabbath day to separate it, adding, as which your Elohim, Yehovah your Elohim, commanded you. And then the identical text resumes again. See how the chart shows whenever there are words added to one or words that are additional in one that are lacking in the other? This is exactly according to the Hebrew. So the Hebrew begins word number 3, right, with the Sabbath day to separate it. That's common in both. So the separation of the Sabbath day, for the reasons given, which we'll get into when we study the Sabbath day, they are indicated here. There are differences, but notice how both of these end with the samech. So there is a white space after Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 says what it intends to say about the word relating to Shabbat. There's a white space. Are these arbitrary, or do they mean to separate the words? Now, a lot of you are saying, yeah, but on my kitchen, I have the Sabbath as number 4, and so that's the way I memorized them. As long as you know them, that's great. But I'm just showing you a way to number the text within the Hebrew text itself. So the sanctification of the Sabbath. The next word deals with give weight. Typically is translated honor your father and your mother. All right. In Hebrew, the literal is to give weight to. Kavod is something which is translated variously. Sometimes kavod, you recognize that word. Does it mean honor? Does it mean glory? Kavod literally means something which is heavy. So you would give weight to your parents. But notice the differences between the two. Deuteronomy adds, after give weight to your father and to your mother, both of those are exactly the same, as which Yehovah your Elohim commanded you, and then it resumes, identical, in order to lengthen your days, Deuteronomy adds, and in order that it will be well with you, and then they resume identical, upon the land which Yehovah your Elohim is giving you. White space. Now, it's not as easy as some have said. Well, clearly the difference here is that Deuteronomy is, Moses is referring back, like God commanded you. But that doesn't account for the differences all the way through, I assure you. And you'll be convinced of that as we work through our study. Now, so that is word number 4. Word number 5 is identical in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 says, "You shall not murder." And it has a samach. So you have a white space that separates out the phrase, "you shall not murder." And then the next one is, "you shall not adulterate," or "you shall not commit adultery." What does that mean? What is adultery? We're going to talk about the details of each of these words. But what does it mean? You shall not adulterate. And I'll be bringing out places where something which is taken on the form of a noun or some other form of speech, when in the Hebrew it's a verb. So I'll be talking about that in great detail. But notice in verse 18 of Deuteronomy 5, directly across, it says, "And you shall not adulterate." Now in the Hebrew, this is only a single letter. It's a vav. The only difference between the two is a single letter. But why does Deuteronomy have a vav? Deuteronomy says, "You shall not murder and you shall not adulterate." Whereas Exodus 20 says, "You shall not murder. You shall not adulterate." All right. After adulterate, word number 7 is, "You shall not steal." You shall not steal. And then it's followed by a white space. In the Hebrew of Deuteronomy 5, it says, "And you shall not steal." There goes Deuteronomy with that added "and." Or some might say, well, maybe Deuteronomy doesn't add anything. Maybe Exodus takes it out. Either way, they're different. So after "you shall not steal," by the way, we're going to look at, over the course of this study, when these commandments are mentioned by the prophets and in later Jewish literature. Are they always given in the same order? We're going to look at that. You shall not steal. The next one is, "You shall not answer against your neighbor as a lying witness." How is that translated in most translations? It's about false testimony, basically, right? So we're going to get into that as well. But notice that even though there's the word "and" is in Deuteronomy, remember that's one Hebrew letter, the vav. But there we have a samach at the end. Now, this is where it gets tricky. And I wanted to bring this up as we wrap things, kind of close things for the week. This last section causes some questions. Notice, in Exodus 20, "You shall not desire," typically translated covet. We'll get into why I selected that. "You shall not desire your neighbor's house." And then look at Deuteronomy. "You shall not desire your neighbor's woman." Major difference. But go back to 20. Exodus 20 picks up, "You shall not desire your neighbor's woman, and his servant, and his handmaid, and his ox, and his donkey, and all that is your neighbor." And then setema, a samach, a white space. Now look at this. "You shall not desire your neighbor's woman. You shall not crave." Notice how it's got red there. "Your neighbor's house, his field, his servant, his handmaid, his ox, his donkey, and all that is for your neighbor." Now, I wanted to bring up a couple of points. This, ladies and gentlemen, is very, very important because we don't have the same text here in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. They begin differently. They contain different items in the list. There is a good bit of similarity. They both begin and end with a Samech, indicating, according to Exodus 20, that this is a single word, if I'm right in identifying the enumeration of the words based on the white spaces. But I must have missed something, because if word 8 dealt with lying witness, then this desiring of the neighbor's house and property and so forth, that's number 9. So what happened? Am I that uncareful that I missed one? Would this then cause me, if I think that this somehow has to be 10, would it then cause me to make one 10 where there's not a break? Now, the Catholics and the Lutherans split this one, and some people laugh at them. Orthodoxy split the first one, making the singular phrase, Anoki Yehovah Elohecha, that phrase that opens as the first word, but there's no white space there. Take a closer look. Look at my chart in Deuteronomy. Notice in Deuteronomy 5:21, the last block of the chart on the right. You shall not desire your neighbor's woman. And then I want you to notice something in the red. See the screen I'm holding up? A setuma, a Samech. There's a Samech in the text here that doesn't appear in Exodus. Now, Exodus doesn't use two different words. It says, you shall not desire your neighbor's house, you shall not desire your neighbor's woman and his servant and his handmaid and his ox and his donkey and all that is your neighbor. In other words, all of those things, if we translate it covet, all of those things are things that we can't covet. Whatever covet means. Covet is a theological parochial word, right? So the idea is that all of those things are equally balanced, and it's illegal, if you will, or it is forbidden to covet any of those things, to desire. But if you look at Deuteronomy, it says, you shall not desire your neighbor's woman. Now there, the Hebrew, if you want to translate tachmod as covet, then you've got covet in both. In fact, in Exodus 20, there is a command. It's not the first command in the word, but there is a command that you not tachmod, that you not covet your neighbor's woman. But it doesn't start with that. It says all of these are the same, whereas Deuteronomy says, you shall not covet or desire your neighbor's woman, white space. Brings us to the close of 9. And then number 10. I'll call this the forgotten commandment, or the missed word of the 10 words, because most people dismiss this. But in the Hebrew, not only is there a white space, but there's a different word beginning the next word. And you shall not crave. Why is there a different word here where it talks about your neighbor's house, his field, his servant, his handmaid, his ox, his donkey, and all that is for your neighbor? Both contain the same context. Both contain a lot of the same material. There are some differences. But I believe that there is to be a distinction between the way one deals with the woman that belongs to a neighbor and his property, as Deuteronomy makes clear. Exodus treats it all as property. Your neighbor's woman, let's see, your neighbor's woman, his servant, his handmaid, his ox, his donkey, and all that is your neighbor. All of that is treated with the same word. You shall not covet any of that. Deuteronomy makes a distinction. It, first of all, pulls your neighbor's woman out of his property. Deuteronomy does this in a few places where it upholds women as something more than property. Now, I believe, and we'll talk about this as we really get into this particular text and really get to the meaning of it, I think that it's going to be very important and you'll see it very clearly. So I now believe that we have identified the 10 words. By the way, in Exodus 20, though there is no marked white space, in quite a few of the Hebrew Bibles that I have looked, that white space is forced, meaning it's placed there even though it's not indicated necessarily by a setuma or a petucha, a samik or a pei, but it's there. It's indicated in the text. They visually represent it as if this has been passed down. But we'll look at that much more in detail in the following classes. So finally, I believe that we are adequately prepared to do a careful study of the 10 words. Words and the meaning thereof. For the purpose of my teaching, I will be following the numbering, the division into 10 that follows Deuteronomy. Okay? In other words, my number 9, when you get to 9 and 10, you have to pick Exodus or Deuteronomy because they're so different. So when I get to 9 and 10, I'm going to go with Deuteronomy. Exodus 9, number 9, the word is you shall not desire or covet the woman of your neighbor. And my number 10 is you shall not crave your neighbor's house, his field, his servant, his handmaid, his ox, his donkey, and all that is for your neighbor. Those are 2 different words. And you'll learn that coming in the next few weeks. So next week, I'm going to kick off with word 1. Now, look back at your chart. Your homework assignment this week is to do some study because I'm going to jump deep into this. I'm going to read you word 1 from Deuteronomy. So you can look at the chart. I am Jehovah your Elohim, who brought you out from the land of Egypt from a house of servants. No, it will be to you other Elohim above my face. No, you shall make for yourself an idol, every form that is in heaven above, and that is on the earth beneath, and that is in the waters beneath the earth. No, you shall bow down to them, and no, you shall serve them, because I, Jehovah your Elohim, zealous El, am accounting iniquity of fathers upon sons, and upon third, and upon fourth, for one's hating me and doing loving kindness to thousands, for one's loving me, and for one's guarding his commands. Question. Here are some things we're going to cover next week. Are there other gods? If you're not supposed to have other gods in addition to God or in His face or before Him, does that imply that there are other gods? What's the difference between monolatry and monotheism? Look, these classes aren't for babies. We're talking to people who study their Scripture. Are there other gods or are there not? And we're going to look deeply at that. What does above my face or before me, what does that even mean? What is an idol? Can someone idolize a person? We use that phrase in English. Is that against the 10 words? If you have a hero that's a badminton player or a horseshoe player, or can you idolize a person? That's one of the things we're going to talk about. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, you know, today money is the idol of all the earth, or shopping can become an idol, or whatever. Is that true? And you have your opinion, but I'm talking about what does the Bible say? Because it's important. We want to make sure that we're looking at this subject from a biblical point. How many commandments are in the first word? Go through and look at them. Count them this week. Look at it and see if you went through and counted it. Does word 1 imply generational curses? You know, people say that, like it says here, counting the iniquity of the fathers upon the third and the fourth. Most people add the word generation. You know, the word generation isn't even in the Hebrew Bible. So what does that mean? Does a son pay for the sins of the father? Is that possible? Is that what this means? We're going to look at that. We're going to look at it from a biblical standpoint, though, and we're going to paint that brush throughout Scripture. We're going to talk about that. What about blessings? If I do what is right, regardless of what my son and my grandson and his son, what about, are they going to be blessed for 1,000 generations because I did right? Is that what that means? Well, if one means that, then the other has to mean that, right? So maybe we're wrong. What does it mean? And much more. I'm prepared next week to cover more than one word in 1 week, meaning I'm prepared to do it. I can do it. But time is going to be the factor. We'll see how far we get in each of these lessons. So next week, we begin by looking at word 1 of the 10. I hope this has been informative. I know it was detailed and very, very meticulous, but hopefully I made it clear and you understand. And if you didn't yet print this out, some of you don't have a printer, but you can at least look at it. You can save it onto your desktop or your device and look at it. And if you don't have a way to print it, let me know. I'll try to get it to you some way, shape, or fashion, but we can help each other. Very important that we study these things, and now you know what are the 10. Until next week, Shabbat Shalom.